Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. I'm Andrew Gustafson, and I'm excited today to talk about the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And so today's a special anniversary that we'll get into in just a second. Again, thank you for joining us. We want to let you know that you can engage with us through the chat. So feel free to drop your questions in there. And Cindy is helping out behind the scenes today. So she'll also be able to answer many questions about the Brooklyn Army Terminal. I just wanted to preface a little bit what we're going to talk about today and why this is such a significant date. So September 22nd, 1958 is when Elvis departed the United States in his Army service. We'll talk about the process of him being drafted and inducted into the Army, and then his service here in the United States, where he did his training. We'll talk, of course, about that fateful day at the Brooklyn Army Terminal and his Army service in Germany. So we're going to talk about, what did this day mean for Elvis? What impact did it have on his career? What impact did this have on the music industry in general, and especially the genre of rock and roll? Because this was a period of actually great upheaval and a lot of uncertainty within the music industry. And then what impact did this have on the Army itself? Because this was obviously a huge public relations coup for the Army. So we'll kind of talk about it at these different scales, using this particular day as a lens to look at the impact that Elvis joining the Army had. And so where I want to start is really with Elvis getting drafted. Obviously he had a meteoric rise in the early 1950s, and we all know about Elvis's famous appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, which really turned him into a household name at a very, very young age, at just 21 years old. So he was, obviously a huge superstar, and putting his career on pause. In a way, we'll talk about how that had negatives, obviously, but some less obvious positives as well for him, and really completely changed the course of his career. So he's this huge star. He's touring around the country. He's appearing on television programs, but he knew that the draft was coming. There were some inklings that he might actually get drafted even before he got the official draft notice. And it's a little bit surprising that he didn't get drafted earlier. He was born in 1935, so he graduates from high school in 1953 while the Korean War is still going on. And so even before he became a big superstar, he actually had been in junior ROTC while in high school. He had done some military training, and he had expected to be drafted into the Army. It didn't happen, though, because the Korean War ended shortly after he graduated from high school. And so at that point, the Army was actually much, much too large. And so there was a period, a sort of a lull in drafting in the mid 1950s. But it would come around again in 1957, and Elvis would be on the list after passing his physical as a 1A potential recruit for the Army. So it was a big press event, obviously. Everything that Elvis did was, but it was a big press event when he received his draft notice. As you can see here, this photo of him at home with the Christmas tree in the background and his dog receiving his draft notice. And at this time, he's already, living in Graceland. He's living there with his parents. And his parents would play a very large role during this period in his life as well, as he prepares to join the Army, and then during his actual Army service. So he receives this draft notice, but he does not immediately report for duty because around this time, he is filming a movie, which was largely filmed down in New Orleans, a movie called King Creole. So he actually got a deferment for about 3 months. So he wouldn't actually have to report to duty and be inducted into the Army until late March 1958. And so this sort of began the narrative that Elvis was going to receive special treatment. And actually, when his draft number was about to come up, there were actually many different, the many different armed services were sort of jockeying for him, who was going to get him, and they were offering him pretty cushy gigs. It was not uncommon for celebrities, at this time who were in the military, to get a job, working. In a band, doing entertainment, being put into an entertainment unit. But Elvis really didn't want to do that. And the people around him who were helping manage his career also thought that it was a bad idea, because they could see right from the very early days when he got this deferment, which also was not unusual. People would get brief deferments like this all the time if they had certain family or job commitments. So it wasn't completely unusual for this to happen. But they could see very early on there could be tremendous backlash if Elvis was not perceived as just an ordinary soldier, if he was seen as getting special treatment. So King Creole gave him a little bit of a reprieve. And then on March, this should say 1958, apologies for the mistake there. He's inducted into the Army in Memphis, Tennessee. And so he is then, he has to show up, I think at like 6 o'clock in the morning. They do their induction, and then they take them out to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, in Western Arkansas, which is where he would get, fully inducted and famously get his haircut. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is how the military service of Elvis has been commemorated in various ways, including in museums. And so this barbershop you see here is now actually a museum. The Army was very, very, they were sort of trying to balance, wanting to have Elvis be a regular soldier, but also, now arguably the most famous person in America is in the Army. So it's a huge, huge potential marketing opportunity for the Army as well. But that could also have consequences, leading people, to do crazy things trying to get at Elvis, including people trying to get his hair after he got his haircut. This is something that built up all this press about it as well, because Elvis was known for having pretty long hair. He did have sideburns, famously, of course, but he'd actually shaved them off to make the movie King Creole already. And so the Army was very worried about people trying to get at his hair, and then creating this market, for Elvis hair and maybe phony Elvis hair. And so they actually ordered all of that hair collected and allegedly destroyed. I just want to give a shout out at this point right here, a great book that actually just came out, and I recommend it to anyone who's an Elvis fan. Really interesting book by Trina Young, about Elvis's time in the Army. And I'll tell you the exact title, and we'll also share a link to it afterwards. So it's Elvis, the Army Years Uncovered. So it has a lot of these great little anecdotes in it that I'll share throughout the program. So Elvis gets his haircut. Obviously, one of the first things you have to do when you get into the Army. And then the other thing you have to do is get your shots. So all manner of inoculations you have to get for when you join the Army. And they don't ask you if you have any objections about it. They just give them to you. And so Elvis, gets his shots here. You can see after he got his haircut. This was not actually the first high-profile vaccination that Elvis got during his career. I found this little detail, which is pretty interesting, that the year before, which was shortly before he appeared on television in New York City in 1956, he actually got the polio vaccine, and they made it actually a big deal about it. And there were all these press items all across the country all about it. And there hasn't been any direct research done about it, but it is believed that this actually gave a huge boost to the polio vaccination rate all across the country, to again have the most famous person in America get the vaccine. So Elvis is a much better role model than, Nicki Minaj, who famously is refusing to get the vaccine for COVID right now. So more pop stars today should be like Elvis. So again, this was a huge PR coup for the Army to have Elvis in their corner. And so there were all manner of marketing events and huge, publicity, although they did, again, try and control the publicity. That was both by the Army and also, of course, by his management team, who we'll talk about as well. So here you can see this whole big spread from 1959 about Elvis in the Army. Now, he did not spend a lot of time in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. Where he ends up going next is actually Fort Hood, Texas. And he would join the 3rd Armored Division, which was a tank unit. And that's where he would do his basic training and spend the next 6 months or so of his Army career. And with him through most of this were actually his parents. So there you can see his father, Vernon, his mother, Gladys, and Elvis in his uniform there with the 3rd Army Division patch on his arm. Now, this photo, I'm not sure exactly when it was taken, but sometime before August of 1958, which is sadly when Elvis's mother died. So his family actually followed him to Fort Hood, and they rented a home there, and he was able to spend time with his mother and father. But in August of 1958, his mother had some health setbacks, and she had been ill for many years, and was taken back to Memphis, where she died of a heart attack. So this was a huge blow for Elvis. He was very close to his mother, and it was something he would carry with him, obviously, for the rest of his life. But it really sort of cast a pall over his military service as well. Luckily he did have his father with him, and so his father actually stayed with him and would come with him to his military service in Germany as well. The other person who was by his side was Colonel Tom Parker. So Colonel Tom Parker was Elvis's manager, and he would be by his side in the days in Elvis's Army days while he was in the United States, but not when he was in Germany. So Colonel Tom Parker was not really a colonel. He was an honorary colonel in the Louisiana militia. He also couldn't come to Germany with Elvis and manage his career kind of directly, because he was actually an undocumented immigrant. He had come to the United States illegally. I believe he was born in the Netherlands. And so he couldn't leave the United States out of fear that he wouldn't be able to come back. So he is sort of this distant figure that's managing Elvis from afar while he's in Germany, and obviously still had a lot of influence and would continue to manage Elvis after his time in the Army. But he wouldn't actually be directly by his side, though he was in those very early days at Fort Hood, and would be there orchestrating everything that happened on September 22nd, 1958 in the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the impact that Elvis's Army service had on the Army, on Elvis's career, but also on the music industry in general. And this was actually a very precarious time for the genre of rock and roll. It had sort of exploded just a few years earlier, and there was every chance that it could kind of burn out and not become, a hugely influential music genre, even still to this day. Because there was a brief window of time when a whole series of very unfortunate events befell some of the biggest stars of the genre. And so we can just walk through them, because Elvis joining the Army was just one of these sort of calamities from the viewpoint of the music industry. Carl Perkins, who had become a big star, also coming out of the same stable as Elvis had at Sun Studios in Memphis, being produced by the famous producer Sam Phillips. But Carl Perkins had a huge hit with Blue Suede Shoes. He then gets in a serious auto accident in 1956, and sort of while he's recovering, Elvis, who had left Sun Studios and gone to RCA, was recorded his own version of Blue Suede Shoes and sort of overshadowed Carl Perkins, who wouldn't kind of become a huge, get back to that place where he was as a huge superstar. Then in October of 1957, you can see here Little Richard. He decides to quit music altogether and become a preacher. And he, again, was one of the biggest stars. And there you can see Jerry Lee Lewis, whose star really dimmed after he decided to marry his cousin, who also happened to be 13 years old. So that was a huge scandal, and his career didn't really recover either. Then the next three figures we see, as everybody knows, tragically died in February 1959, Buddy Holly, Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens, who sadly died in a plane crash. Then in December of 1959, Chuck Berry is arrested under the Mann Act, which is a law that says it's illegal to move minors across state line for immoral purposes. And then there we have Bill Haley. Bill Haley's a figure who will pop up again in just a couple of minutes. But Bill Haley, who obviously had a huge hit with Rock Around the Clock, he really couldn't maintain his popularity in the United States. And he actually chose to spend most of the next few years with his band, the Comets, touring in Australia and in Europe. So he really never achieved, really big stardom again. So you can see all of these leading lights of rock and roll are in various ways sort of receding from the limelight. And it seems that rock and roll as a genre is on its way out. And of course, Elvis joining the army and just being completely out of commission for 2 years, thought that would kind of be the end of it. And in some ways, you could say this was the end of the rock and roll period for Elvis as well. And we'll talk about the ways in which he changed personally, and that would have a huge influence on the music industry, and what were his personal interests, personal musical preferences. And you can see, his catalog would change pretty radically after his time in the army, as would his focus on music. Instead, he would focus on other pursuits that we'll talk about as well. So he does his basic training in Fort Hood. He's with the 3rd Armored Division, and that unit gets called up and is going to be sent to Germany. And so this is Elvis arriving at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So he arrived, like so many troops before and after him did, via train. As you know, if you've been to the Brooklyn Army Terminal or been to any of our programs about the Army Terminal, it was an intermodal shipping port, which was designed to accommodate both trains and ships. And so, at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, we had about 17 miles of railroad track for all of these trains coming in. Now, famously, the Brooklyn Army Terminal has these 2 huge warehouse buildings, one of which, Building B, has its massive atrium where you could drive trains directly into the building. That atrium was exclusively for freight trains. Now, when passenger trains did come into the Brooklyn Army Terminal, they would drive directly onto the piers, which is what Elvis's train did when it pulled in after its, I believe, 2+ day journey from Texas, with a stopover in Memphis, actually, his adopted hometown. And so here you can see him getting off the train, and the idea was that soldiers arriving at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, their train would pull right up on the pier, and then they would literally just have to walk a few feet from the train to get onto the ship that was waiting for them. And in World War II, sometimes these movements would be facilitated in a matter of minutes. Most of the soldiers who arrived with Elvis, and there were over 1,000 of them that were deploying with him and the unit, they did, get to make that little jaunt across the pier to get onto the ship. But Elvis Elvis had some work to do. Namely, he had to do some PR work for the Army, and so he was waylaid a bit in order to do these press conferences. So here we can see where he did those press conferences, where he arrived on these piers. These piers here we can see Pier 2 in the foreground, and then 3 and 4. They had these two-story pier sheds on top of them. And so the trains, you can see actually the railroad tracks right down here. So the trains would drive into these bay doors right here. These, you can see well in this picture, a sky bridge that connects actually over to Warehouse A. That was really just for moving freight. And so Elvis didn't go into the sky bridges. Elvis didn't go into building A or building B. He spent all of his time actually on the far pier here, which is pier number 4. Let's see a little bit of that presser. So here we can see him. This, I believe, is actually at the second press conference that he did. So he had to do one press conference on the pier standing up, and there was a gaggle of at least 250 members of the media that were there. So it was a huge event. And after that press conference, they took him actually upstairs to the second floor of the Pier 4 pier shed to actually to do a sit-down press conference there. And again, Colonel Tom Parker was by his side throughout this entire ordeal, helping to orchestrate the whole thing. And of course, they made sure that they had Army recruiting posters that were behind him. So those would appear in newspapers and film reels all around the world. So before we get to the boarding sequence and his time on the ship, I just wanted to show you a little clip of Elvis's press conference and him talking about, the perception of him getting special treatment.
No, sir, I was very surprised. I've never met a better group of boys in my life. They probably would have if it'd been like everybody thought. I mean, everybody thought I wouldn't have to work and I would be given special treatment and this and that. But when they looked around and saw I was on KP and I was pulling guard and everything just like they were, well, they figured, well, he's just like us.
Elvis, what do you think about going to Germany?
Well, sir, I'm kind of looking forward to it. I mean, just before I came in the Army, we were planning a tour of Europe. And I got quite a bit of mail from over there and everything, and I'm kind of looking forward to it, really.
Yeah, and Elvis he mentions that they were planning a tour of Europe, but I believe he had only left the country once to go to Canada very briefly in his life. So this is his first time traveling overseas, and he would travel a little bit around Europe while he was there, not extensively. But I just wanted to note a couple of the comments we had here. So Paula says, Viva Las Vegas is my favorite Elvis movie. And she says that it has Anne Margaret at her best. Cindy also mentioned something, a story I've heard many times before, which is that Elvis's performance in the Ed Sullivan Show was the very first time my grandparents allowed my dad and siblings to watch television on a Sunday, which was a little scandalous. And someone says, legendary Channel 4 newsman Gabe Pressman is at Elvis's right in the press conference photo. Thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing that, Ken. Yeah, so, he had to, do all this press and it took, over an hour of him just sort of being taken here and there. Now, one thing about the time at the Brooklyn Army Terminal is that they did not let a huge number of fans come in. There were actually several hundred that were waiting outside the gates of the Brooklyn Army Terminal who couldn't get in. So the people that were allowed in, there was a limited number, and many of them were actually the children of workers at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. There were other, young people that were there as well, because many of the people that were on board that were boarding the ship to go to Germany were also, families and dependents of soldiers. So it wasn't just soldiers. So there were a lot of Elvis fans that were there, but there weren't throngs of thousands and thousands of people that were there with him. So here you can see Elvis is boarding the troop ship that would take him, the USS General George M. Randall. And you can see him carrying a gunny sack. Now, they would, as I said, they were supposed to just walk from the train, and then they would, walk across a gangway and get on board the ship. Elvis, though, was a little different. Again, I said there were over 200 members of the press that were there, and all of them wanted a photo. So Elvis was sort of, impressed into carrying the gunny sacks of many, many different soldiers back and forth across the gangway so that everybody could get pictures of him. So according to the photographer who took this picture and actually photographed Elvis extensively in his early career, Alfred Wertheimer. This was actually the last photos that he took of Elvis, was at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. But he reported that Elvis walked back and forth at least 8 times, carrying the packs of other soldiers to get all of the photographs of him. And here you go. Here you can see him on board the ship. And again, you can see young people around him as well as all of his fellow soldiers. This is one of the most famous photos of Elvis, of his departure from the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which appeared in Life magazine in 1958. And this was actually reported all across the country, which says, kissing farewell to brash admirer Lillian Portnoy, Elvis goes up the gangplank. The lenient MPs led a few of the insistent fans through the line. So yeah, Lillian Portnoy was not a family member of a soldier or of a worker at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. She was actually sort of a socialite from Beverly Hills, California, who had come to see Elvis, and she had followed Elvis around. And so she kind of pushed her way in and gave Elvis a kiss. And one thing that would dominate the headlines throughout Elvis's time in the Army, and actually his life while he was in Germany, was his relationships with various women. Lillian Portnoy was not one. This was a one-time kiss here, but there were just constant reports about Elvis's love life during his time in the Army. And we won't go into great detail about that on the program today, but there's lots of places you can read about that, including Trina Young's book. And this is the ship that took him. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what was the role of the Brooklyn Army Terminal at this time, and what kind of deployments were they doing. So the Army Terminal, this is during the Cold War. It had been mobilized to a certain degree for the Korean War, and there were actually, troops and supplies that were sent to Korea from New York, but its primary focus was on, Europe and the Mediterranean, just as it had been during World War II. And so it actually had pretty regular passenger service on a series of ships. There were actually 6 of them, troop ships just like the Randall, that were doing regular service back and forth between Brooklyn and Bremerhaven, Germany. Now, if you go inside the atrium of the Brooklyn Army Terminal, you can see we have these markings still on the wall of various destinations around the world that date from roughly this time period. And they indicate various destinations. Germany was not one of them that's painted on the wall, but we do see areas like Africa, the Azores, Portugal, Greece, the Balkans. Those are the real areas of focus for troops and supplies being sent out from the Army Terminal. Elvis sort of being deployed with these large numbers of troops kind of being sent over at once. Like I mentioned, there were over 1,100 troops that were with his unit. This was also sort of the results of a new strategy or process by the Army for deploying troops overseas. Previously, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, troops would often be sent piecemeal as replacements for various units being sent around the world. But they actually developed a process of sending whole units and their families all at once, which is known as Operation Gyroscope, which was developed and sort of they fully implemented by 1955. And so that's how you see the 3rd Armored Division going over in this large group. with Elvis in 1958. However, this also kind of represented the beginning of the end for troop movements of this type as well, as we'll see a little bit later on when Elvis comes back to the United States. But this is a time of great transformation on the waterfront in New York City and in Brooklyn, because just a couple years before, in 1956, we had the introduction of the shipping container. We did a whole program about that with Mark Levinson earlier this year for the 65th anniversary of the shipping container. But those shipping containers, as they began to be adopted in the late 50s and 60s, would really kind of it would cause this huge upheaval in the shipping industry and really transform the waterfront of New York, because places like the Brooklyn Army Terminal with these big warehouses, were no longer useful for containerized shipping. So we're kind of looking here in 1958 at the beginning of the end of the Army Terminal, as well as new technologies and new needs for the military start to come into play. So the crossing from Brooklyn to Bremerhaven took 8 days. And along the way, Elvis, developed a lot of camaraderie with his fellow soldiers and developed many friendships that would, continue through his life. And one of the ways that he did this was through music, obviously. Now, Elvis did not perform hardly at all. He performed hardly at all during his Army career. And there are just a few sort of candid shots like this one. You can see of him playing the piano. They did have a piano on board the ship. Part of Operation Gyroscope is also making these troop ships a lot more comfortable for not just troops, but also their families. Certainly much more comfortable than the troop ships were during World War II. So you can see here Elvis playing on the piano, and he did some sort of impromptu gigs with fellow musicians that were on board. But he really didn't perform very much at all, and never performed officially. He did a couple of sort of secret gigs for his fellow soldiers, but nothing really beyond that, and no official shows. And they sort of explained this, why Elvis wasn't performing, why he wasn't doing USO shows and things like that, and that the Army was very sensitive to the perception that Elvis was not being treated like other soldiers. So if he was going around and performing to huge crowds, that might feed into that perception. That's part of the reason. The other part of the reason was probably also his manager did not want him performing for free. And so they kept a very tight lid on his performances and his recordings as well. Colonel Tom Parker was very good at sort of hoarding Elvis's recordings and releasing them on a certain cycle so that they could keep up his profile. And so they continued to do that while he was in the Army as well, because Elvis was very concerned about the potential impact that it could have on his career, and that he would face, no one would recognize him anymore once he got to the United States, back to the United States. That was certainly not the case. So here you can see Elvis arriving at the Port of Embarkation in Bremerhaven. I should mention one of the other things that they did at the Brooklyn Army Terminal was the bass, the band at the Army Terminal. The 328th Army Band actually performed a number of Elvis hits when he departed, and they performed them as well here in Bremerhaven when he arrived. And he was greeted by a much, much larger throng of people in Germany that greeted him on the pier in Bremerhaven. Oops. Now, Elvis would go with his unit down to a place called Friedberg in Germany, where he would, spend the next 18 months. He did, have the opportunity, though, early on in his time in Germany to go see a fellow musician, Bill Haley, who did a couple of concerts in Germany. And so here you can see Elvis actually went backstage with him on October 23rd, 1958, when he did a show in Wiesbaden. You know, like I said, Bill Haley's career kind of went in decline in the United States. He was still very popular in Germany, although and throughout Europe, although his tours in Europe were somewhat controversial because many of them actually sparked riots. There were major riots in the UK and in Germany. So that also kind of, you know, cast a pall over his career as well. Luckily, that didn't happen at the show in Wiesbaden when Elvis was there. And Elvis also didn't, you know, reportedly sit in the crowd either, not wanting to cause a you know, cause a riot himself, because he was, you know, thronged everywhere he went. And he, you know, did a pretty good job of sort of managing people's expectations and also giving the fans what they wanted. He had a huge following in Europe at the time, and he actually almost most evenings he would actually, you know, have kids coming up to his door and he would sign autographs for them. Now, one thing is that those kids would come to his door, not at the barracks. Elvis did not live in the barracks while he was in Germany. Now, typically that was a privilege that was reserved for soldiers who had families, namely wives and children. However, Elvis did come to Germany with his father, and actually a whole entourage of bodyguards and managers, but and also his grandmother. And so because he was living with two dependents, Vernon Presley and his grandmother, Minnie May, he was allowed to find housing off base. And so he lived in a couple different places during his time in Germany. Although he never moved into a castle, as was reported at the time, that he was looking for a German castle to live in. Here you can see Elvis. This is a photo that appeared in Life magazine. This is in Grafenwehr. So in late 1958, they went on maneuvers for about 6 weeks. And so Elvis was out in the field. And so the Life photographer Loomis Dean captured this photo, which Elvis's team wasn't super excited about this photo spread because they felt it didn't sort of portray him as being an ordinary soldier. But, you know, here you can see it looks like he's kind of performing for his fellow soldiers, which he did sometimes, but this doesn't really make him look like an ordinary GI. But, you know, Grafenwehr, this time in Grafenwehr, there were a number of, you know, important events during his time in the Army, including the fact that he actually did one of his only, you know, full-scale performances. Again, it was kept highly secret, and it was really only for fellow soldiers, but he did do some performances in a venue while he was in Grafenwehr. The other thing is that it's believed that while he was on these maneuvers, you know, Elvis suffered throughout his life from insomnia, and it was pretty hard living in the winter, you know, in the mountains in Bavaria, and Elvis, you know, would often have to stay up all night long, and being in a, you know, frigid tent. It's believed that it was during this time that his dependency on amphetamines, which he had been using prior to his time in the Army, but his dependency really worsened, and that was something that he would struggle with throughout the rest of his life. You know, I've actually, you know, I'm a big fan of Elvis. I've been to Elvis's birthplace in Tupelo, Mississippi. I've been to Graceland, and obviously that's not a story that they like to tell with the official stories of Elvis, but it's, you know, something we know to be true, that he did struggle with drug abuse. I actually have a friend who, back in the day, they used to have guided tours of Graceland. Now, the last time I went to Graceland, it was a pre-recorded tour, actually narrated by Priscilla Presley, but a friend who used to be a tour guide there, and she was fired for saying that Elvis abused drugs. But yeah, that's something that kind of worsened during his time in the Army. Um, and so here we can see him in the place where he lived with his family, which was at Bad Neuheim, which was actually a resort town in Germany, not far from the base where he was in Friedberg. But in the spring of 1959, Colonel Tom Parker actually sent over a photographer, Don Cravens, who had photographed Elvis before and actually photographed some of his early journey in the Army, sent him over to do a series of publicity photos. And again, as I mentioned, Parker was really good at sort of slowly eking out, as we say today, content to keep Elvis in the public eye. And this is something they did with these photos as well, which were used for a number of different album covers. And we'll talk more about this photo in particular when he's standing on a footbridge over the Usa River in Bad Neuheim. But this was also a time while he was in Bad Neuheim when they actually he started to work on his movie career again. And we'll talk a little bit about the next movie that he made after leaving the Army. And so the two movies that sort of bookended his Army career, obviously had an influence on it, because he actually, like I said, he had got a deferment to make King Creole from the Army. And then they actually started making his next movie while he was still in the Army. I see Paula has a comment here, said in 1959, my dad, who was in the Navy, was shipped over to Bremerhaven a year after Elvis. My sister was born there in 1959. Yeah, Bremerhaven was a huge hub for the U.S. Military. And like I said, there was pretty regular traffic back and forth between New York Harbor and Bremerhaven. Another big impact that his time in Germany had on his life was, of course, that he met Priscilla Presley while he was there. Priscilla was the daughter of a member of the Air Force, actually. And like I said, Elvis had a very, very long romantic career while he was in Europe. He went to Paris a number of times, and he had said before he left the United States that his ambition while he was in Europe was to meet Brigitte Bardot, which he never managed to do, but he met lots and lots of other women. But the one who managed to capture his heart eventually was Priscilla Presley. When they met in late 1959, she was actually 14 years old. So we talked before about the scandal with Jerry Lee Lewis. Now, she wasn't his cousin, but she was very young, and Elvis actually told the press that she was 16 at the time, but she was just 14 years old. And actually, when he left in March of 1960, she would stay behind with her family. Obviously, they wouldn't see each other again for another 2 years, but they maintained a one-way correspondence. Priscilla continued to write Elvis, and he wouldn't write her back, but he would send her gifts and things. So they maintained their relationship. So that was one thing that Elvis did bring back with him from Germany, which was Priscilla, and they would get married in 1967 and have their daughter Lisa Marie. So there's a 10-year age gap between them. So Elvis comes back to the United States. So in March of 1960, Elvis does not go back to Bremerhaven. He does not get on a ship. Instead, he gets on an airplane. And again, this is an indication of how the Army is changing. And as we enter the 1960s, we see more and more troop movement by air travel, which would also, sort of sideline places like the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So he does arrive in our area, though. He has his ceremony where he's discharged from the Army, actually at Fort Dix. So he landed at McGuire Air Force Base, which is adjacent to Fort Dix. And so the movie that I said he was making towards the end of his time in the Army was GI Blues. Now, Elvis did not film any scenes for this movie while he was in the Army, but they did send a film crew over there to get sort of B-roll of Germany and of the 3rd Armored Division. So you can see here in this poster, he's wearing that same patch. So he plays a character very, very loosely based on himself. He is, of course, a singer, as is Elvis in all of his movies, because they're musicals. Not all of them later in his career, but it's pretty common trope in his movies. But he's struggling to. He wants to open a nightclub so he can perform with his friends after he gets out of the army. But they filmed all of this B-roll in Germany to get sort of a realistic sense of what army life was like in Germany. But of course, there were some artistic licenses taken. Although Elvis did serve in a tank division, he did not drive a tank as he does in this movie. He actually drove a Jeep. That was Elvis's job. I should have mentioned that earlier, but Elvis's job was actually driving a scout Jeep. Usually what he was driving around, senior enlisted and officers. But he was a scout Jeep driver. He was regarded to be a pretty, proficient driver and proficient in a lot of different skills in the army. So much so that he actually achieved the rank of sergeant by the time he left, which, again, some people felt was maybe him getting special treatment. It was certainly it wasn't impossible, but I think it illustrated his actually pretty good proficiency as a soldier. He took his job and he took his brief career in the army pretty seriously, but he did not drive a tank, as you can see here. And here you can see him again performing something he also did not do while he was in the army. He did not perform in this movie. He's performing at like a cabaret place in Germany. He didn't do that for the general public. Just a couple performances that he did for fellow soldiers. He did, however, continue to write music and did a limited number of recordings. But one thing that he kind of recognized while he was in the army is that rock and roll wasn't his true passion. And he could also see, like everybody else could, that rock and roll maybe was a flash in the pan. Maybe there wasn't a big future in it. And so he took the time in the army to really kind of embrace other musical styles that he really enjoyed, including, of course, gospel music. And so when you see his catalog after his time in the army, there's fewer and fewer what we would consider rock and roll hits, and more of songs that are more influenced by the gospel style or more sort of crooner type songs. And one person that he kind of tried to model his career on was Frank Sinatra, in that music was a way for him to get his foot into the show business game, but he really wanted to become not just an actor but a serious actor, which Frank Sinatra was able to do. So Elvis comes back to the United States. They finish filming GI Blues, and Elvis actually really stops performing almost completely. So he performs actually on a TV special for Frank Sinatra in March of 1960. So just a few days after he gets back to the United States. And then in February 1961, he does a couple benefit concerts in Memphis. And then on March 25th, 1961, he goes to Hawaii and does a benefit concert to raise money for the USS Arizona Memorial. And so, Hawaii is, when we think about the different places that are very closely associated with Elvis, obviously there's Memphis, Las Vegas, and you'd also have to put Hawaii up there as well. It was a place he really loved and cared for. And so he put on this benefit concert to raise money for the USS Arizona. So we started, with the Army, and now he sort of concludes this period of his musical career with the Navy at Pearl Harbor. And so he doesn't perform live for 7 years. until 1968, when he has a big TV special, which is known as the Elvis Comeback Special. Interestingly, 1968, so this is a year after he and Priscilla got married, that was actually the first time she'd ever seen him perform live. And at that point, they'd known each other already for 9 years. So we think about Elvis as a musician, but this was the time when he really kind of committed himself to being a movie star and made a lot of movies in the years afterwards. So we're just about out of time. And again, we can keep going talking about Elvis's career, because obviously after he left the Army, it would continue, for another 17 years. With all its ups and downs. But I wanted to just make a special note of a couple of the places that we mentioned before. So, Elvis is like George Washington. If he slept somewhere, there's probably some sort of plaque or memorial that's there. And many of the places that we mentioned already actually got that treatment. So this is in Fort Smith, Kansas. So where Fort Chaffee is located. This is the Chaffee Barbershop Museum, which only opened actually back in 2008, but they managed to save the barber chair that Elvis is in and recreate the barbershop just as it was in March of 1958 when he got his famous haircut. So if you're ever in that part of Arkansas, you can go check that out. There is a plaque in Bremerhaven at the cruise terminal where Elvis landed. So October 1st, 1958, it says Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, where his ship landed. Now, unfortunately, this plaque is not accessible to the public because it's within the cruise terminal. So I guess if anyone has plans to go on a cruise departing from Bremerhaven, you get a chance to see it, but it's not visible to the public. Now, alternatively, we'll come back to these. I would like to propose that the New York City Economic Development Corporation and the City of New York place a plaque here on Pier 4 at the Army Terminal, because this is where he left from. And so I think this is a site very deserving of commemoration. And it just so happens that Pier 4 is the only pier that's still surviving. So Piers 1, 2, and 3 were removed about 20 years ago because they fell into disrepair. But the city decided to refurbish Pier 4 and keep it for various municipal purposes. So here at Pier 4, we have a large municipal parking lot. It's a very popular fishing pier, and this is also where the NYC ferry docks at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. So there's a lot of people moving through there, and I think that would be a great place for a memorial plaque as a partner to the one that our friends over in Bremerhaven have already built. So a couple other things I just wanted to mention. So at the Culture and Military Museum of Grafenwehr, they actually have the piano. So this was a piano that was in the establishment where Elvis did his sort of secret performance in late 1959. So they have that saved and put on display. So you can see a piano that Elvis actually played. And then here, this is in Bad Neuheim. This is that bridge where Elvis was photographed for that photo shoot in the spring of 1959. And just a month ago, the town unveiled this bronze statue of Elvis, which is a recreation of that photo. So Bad Neuheim is a place that's really embraced their Elvis history. And so there's plaques all over the place, and there's a museum about Elvis there because of his Army time. So this, if you are keeping track of your Elvis landmarks, this is a new one now that you have to go and check out in Germany. I've heard this is a beautiful town, so it's worth visiting anyway. And then I will just add that if you've been to the Brooklyn Army Terminal, you may have seen this sign that we used to have up, a display about Elvis's departure from the Brooklyn Army Terminal. We don't have it up anymore. We would really love to see more interpretive displays about the Army Terminal's history, not just about Elvis, in the lobby. But this one, I believe, was taken down because of issues over photography rights with Alfred Wertheimer. So we don't have that one up anymore. But I think a plaque would be a great way to commemorate Elvis's time at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. Of course, that is a very, very common entry point for people, coming to the Army Terminal and coming on our tours, is that they know its association with Elvis. So, we like to say that, he's the most famous person to visit the Brooklyn Army Terminal, though I will add that Winston Churchill did visit the Brooklyn Army Terminal, and Franklin Roosevelt came there twice. So I guess it just depends on your frame of reference. So that just about wraps it up. If anyone has any last questions you'd like to drop in here to the chat before we go, but I just want to thank you all so much for joining me today. This is a really fun topic to research and a fun presentation to put together. Again, I'll give a plug for Trina Young's book, so go check that out. It's available. You can get an ebook version of it, and it's a really, really great little read. And I learned a lot about Elvis. So thank you all so much. Join us this evening at 6 o'clock, where we're doing a free program with our friends at the Olmsted Beale House. And then join us on Monday. We'll be talking about the history of America's naval shipyards. So thanks so much. Have a great day, and we will see you later today.